Hello, I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine, Content Specialist for the Florida Joint Center for Citizenship, which is part of the School of Politics, Security, and International Affairs at the University of Central Florida in Orlando. Welcome to our Middle School Civics Highlights series. Today we will be looking at Benchmark 1.9, in which we will describe how the U.S. Constitution limits the powers of government through separation of powers, checks and balances, individual rights, rule of law, and due process of law. In Part 2, we focus on recognizing examples of separation of powers and checks and balances, and the influence of the U.S. Constitution on the development of other governments. So here we're going to be recognizing examples of both separation of powers and checks and balances, as well as looking at the development of other governments. In looking at these examples, we will get a very good sense about how the U.S. Constitution, as it was originally ratified, as well as through some of its amendments, has affected how other nations around the world have modeled their own constitutions when they have secured independence. So first, let's look at an example of separation of powers. On January 6, 2023, U.S. Representative Kevin McCarthy was elected House Speaker after 15 roll call votes. Senator McCarthy won by a vote of 216 to 212, with 6 members voting present, meaning that they didn't take a side yes for Representative McCarthy to be Speaker or no for Representative McCarthy to be Speaker. How is this an example of separation of powers? Because it is only the members of the U.S. House of Representatives that may select their Speaker. It's only the U.S. House of Representatives that can nominate a Speaker, vote on a Speaker, and determine who the winner of the speakership is. So it's a separated power because the Senate and the other branches of government are not involved. Let's look at a second example. On February 7, 2023, President Joseph R. Biden delivered the State of the Union address in the chamber of the U.S. House of Representatives. The audience included members of Congress, most cabinet members, the U.S. Supreme Court, and guests. The reason that this is also an example of separation of powers is that the decision whether or not to deliver a State of the Union is up to the president alone. So there is a tradition that the Speaker of the House conveys a formal invitation to deliver that State of the Union address in the House chamber, but the president can deliver the State of the Union in the form of a letter or a report or some other way, as long as the State of the Union address is delivered to Congress. Then the president has fulfilled his responsibility to deliver a State of the Union from time to time. That's what the Constitution requires. It doesn't need to be an annual address. It doesn't have to happen ever, because the interpretation about what from time to time means is certainly left up to people who are perhaps in the position to either deliver a State of the Union address or to ask the president for a State of the Union address. So that's why these two examples are examples of separation of powers, these two events. Let's look at two examples of checks and balances. On July 2, 1964, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law after being passed by both houses of Congress. The reason that this is an example of checks and balances is that the president cannot sign legislation unless that legislation has already been passed by both houses of Congress and then presented to the president. Once the president is presented with any bill that has passed both houses of Congress, then the president may decide to reject the bill, that's a veto, or the president may decide to sign the bill. And that's exactly what President Lyndon Johnson did on July 2, 1964. Let's be clear though, the president asked Congress to pass a civil rights bill that he could then sign. But that's the president sort of serving as a person who tries to persuade Congress which bills that he's going to sign. That was not the president using a formal power that is listed in the U.S. Constitution. Let's look at our second example. On October 25, 1973, President Richard Nixon vetoed the War Powers Resolution after being passed by both houses of Congress. Congress overrode the president's veto on November 7, 1973. So here we actually have two examples of checks and balances within case study number 2. First, Congress did present the War Powers Resolution to the president, and through the checks and balances process, the president vetoed it. However, the U.S. Constitution gives to the Congress the power to override the president's veto, which is a check on the president, and Congress exercised its power to do so. To pass a law, both houses of Congress must vote yes on that proposed law, what we call a bill, at least 50%. But to override the president's veto, the requirement is 2/3 of each house of Congress. With that said, though, if we look at history, we see that of all the president's vetoes, only 7% of those vetoes have been overridden. What this means is that if the president vetoes a law that Congress has passed, the president gets their way 93% of the time. So when we're talking about political engagement between the branches, it's often good for them to have conversations about what the president will and will not sign. Because if the president expects to veto a bill, why would the Congress go through this process of passing a bill, knowing that historically only 7% of the time has any veto been overridden? So we're going to be focusing our attention on the influence of the U.S. Constitution on the development of other governments, focusing on India. India adopted its constitution in 1949, and I'd like you to take a look at the language of the preamble of the Constitution of India. Look at the first 3 words of the Constitution. It's the same first 3 words as the first 3 words of the U.S. Constitution, "We the people." Now, the preamble to the U.S. Constitution has one purpose, and that is to lay out the goals and purposes of government. So the preamble itself does not focus on any institutions of government, any powers of government, etc. What the U.S. Constitution preamble does, just like the India Constitution preamble, is to demonstrate right away at the very beginning that this Constitution and this government belong to we the people. So looking at some of these goals and purposes, we see a focus on justice, liberty, equality, fraternity, focusing on the dignity of the individual and the unity and integrity of the nation. And those specific principles were then adopted, look at that language, in our constituent assembly. So in the U.S. preamble, the end of that preamble focuses on ordaining and establishing the Constitution of the United States. So we, the people, have adopted this Constitution. So here we see the emphasis on the same idea. In our constituent assembly, in our constituent assembly, we hereby adopt, enact, and give to ourselves this Constitution. And so what we have here is that we have a lot of evidence of influence of the U.S. Constitution on the development of other governments. Thank you for joining me for Middle School Civics Highlights. Do you still have questions? If so, please contact us using the information that appears on the screen. Till next time, I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine. Thank you for joining me.